My name is Lykke Friis, one of the co-chairs of ECFR and also head of a think tank here in Copenhagen, and it's 3 o'clock. So let's get started. Everyone wants development, no one wants change. This quote by the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard sums up what we'll be doing in the next 15 minutes, because this is going to be difficult, because the EU has to change in the new world that we are living in with Russia, China, and United States. But right now, we do not really have the tools in order to defend ourselves. So which tools do we need? How do we then actually get there? This will be some of the questions that we'll try to answer during this webinar. Before we start, a few sort of housekeeping remarks. The event is public and on the record. We will post it on YouTube and our website afterwards. At the end of this event, we'll have a Q&A session, and you can there use the Q&A function on Zoom. Our discussion is based on the ECFR policy brief, the brand new one, no brain, no brawn, how Trump 2.0 makes an EU economic security network essential. And if you've read the brief, and I'm sure you have, then you will have noticed that our authors have given us a late Easter egg, a new acronym, Economic Security Network, ESN. Thank you very much for that one as well. To discuss all this, we have, as we always say at ECFR, an all-star cast, because obviously we only invite brilliant people, and I'll introduce you as we go along. First up is Agathe Demarais, Senior Policy Fellow and Head of Geoeconomics Initiative at ECFR. So let's kick this off basically by taking a mental journey to the White House. How can the EU best respond to Trump's tariffs, no matter how high they are today and next week? Over to you.
Thanks a lot, Lykke. Delighted to be here today. So, of course, a very easy question, and I think I have about 3 minutes to give a strategy for Europeans to respond to Trump's tariffs. I think my view is don't panic. And it may be useful here to take a step back and actually take a look at stranded sailors. And I was reading a few months ago the history of sailors from the Grafton ship, who in 1864 landed essentially on a rock in subarctic territory. And they managed to survive for 20 months. And I think that they actually give 3 very interesting lessons for Europeans about how to respond to the Trump storm. The first lesson is essentially to remain united. And I think that this will be very important for Europeans to avoid fragmentation. And we will talk a lot about fragmentation today as we delve into the EU economic security network. So that's the first lesson. The second lesson is about trying to avoid making panicked decisions, essentially doing bad things, making bad choices because of panic. I'm thinking here, for instance, of plans to appease Trump by boosting LNG imports from the US. The US already supplies half of Europe's LNG imports, so maybe not a good idea to increase reliance. And the third thing is having a focus on the long run. The sailors didn't know how much time they would spend on the island, well, the rock, really, but they did build immediately a shelter that actually saved their lives in the winter months. And I think that here, this is really interesting, actually, from the European Union perspective, because the idea is to make Trump an opportunity and to seize this opportunity to do reforms that would have been unthinkable politically only a few months ago. And from that perspective, when we take a look at everything that is coming to Europeans from Trump, but also from Russia, from China, it's clear that the challenges are often geoeconomics related. That is to say that they link economics, geopolitics, the use of economic tools to exert geopolitical influence. And so from that perspective, we would argue with Abe that the EU needs to step up its game from the geoeconomics perspective. So you can have a think about reforms to deepen the single market. You can have a think about, steps to boost innovation financing, but you can also have a think about the EU's institutional framework and setup to deal with economic security, economic statecraft. And this is where a potential EU economic security network comes in. And I'm sure that we will talk a lot more about it today in the event.
The ESN, and thank you very much for taking us back to the sailors. Being a Dane, we always love talking about sailors. Abraham Newman, thank you so much for joining us. You are at the Georgetown University, and you've been co-writing this paper with Agathe. So my question to you at the beginning is, okay, ESN is important, and without it, are we then at the mercy of the US and China?
Well, I mean, I think the core point of our intervention is to say, if you want to be a leader in these questions, and if you want to make sure to safeguard your interests, then you have to have the institutions that allow you to do it. And unfortunately, Europe has not just become economically dependent on the US or China, but it is often institutionally dependent on the US. So when you think about sanctions, often the targeting, which actors should be the focus of European efforts, it's done with the deep assistance of US institutions. And so you can increasingly imagine that that assistance will not be forthcoming. And so you need, on not just the high level, strategic level, action at the European Union, but you also need, just at the nitty gritty, you need to be able to say who should be targeted and what would be the consequences of doing that. And that's where, it's just a story that repeats itself in European Union history, which is that a lot of the competences for that kind of action are at the member state level. So even if the European Commission has a great plan, a great economic security strategy, has identified key goals, it relies on the member states in order to implement those strategies. And at least right now, there's very little linking amongst the member states in these domains in order to maximize the expertise that they have. And as we describe in the report, this is a problem that has been solved in many other domains of the European single market. So if you think about telecoms, competition policy, data privacy, you have this type of network structure which provides a governance system, but also it allows coordination to happen amongst the different member states so that they're not just acting individually, but they're coordinating together to solve the problems that Europe faces.
So there's a disconnect between the EU level and the member state level. That is one of your core points, and also core point in the paper.
Well, I mean, I think actually there's several problems that we hope to address. One of them is the flow of information from the Commission to the member states, because the Commission can say, this should be our strategy, but how does that then get to the member states, the actual people, the bureaucrats who every day implement these policies? But then there's another problem, which is those people, it's like offices all across the member states, on a day-to-day basis, they're learning what works and what doesn't work. And how does the Commission figure that out? So you need the communication back from the ground level, back up to Brussels. So that's a second kind of problem that this kind of network structure tries to solve. But the third is that there's often not communication amongst the member state regulators. And so you get arbitrage, it's like bad actors. They try to find weaknesses in the domain of data privacy. For example, there's often this talk about Ireland. Ireland is the main enforcer. A lot of big global companies sit in Ireland. And so if you're the German regulator, you're frustrated because the Irish regulator might have different preferences than you have, or it might not be able to have the capacity, the expertise that you would want it to have. And so what they did is they created this network of regulators. And so when there's a trans-border issue, something that affects many member states, they coordinate on those types of questions. Ultimately, the Irish regulator is going to be the implementer, but the German regulator, the French regulator, they participate in those types of questions. And so I think that kind of structure, it solves the up, the down, and the sideways problems that just happen in a complicated, system like the European Union. But it is a system that there are already toolkits to how to make it better, particularly in an environment where the United States and China are throwing, new challenges, really existential challenges at Europe.
And we'll later sort of speak with Denis Redonnet. He will join us. He's already there, but come with his comments to some of these ideas. And you are Deputy Director General for Trade and Economic Security, and a warm welcome to you. I'll introduce you later more specifically. Agathe, it is not as if we are starting completely from scratch. I guess we agree upon that. If we just look upon what's happening today, we have Commissioner Dan Jørgensen coming out with his proposal on how Europe can limit itself from Russian fossil fuels. So I think that is one example that the European Union is already active in this particular space. So what is it that we really have to do now that we're not able to do when you look upon the present political situation?
Well, I think that to answer this question, it may be useful to act a bit like a doctor, you know, a medical doctor, and try to make a diagnosis of the shortcomings of the European Union in the field of economic security or economic statecraft. And what I found really interesting while Abe and I were researching our policy brief is that there are three seemingly very basic questions that one can ask about how things work for economic security or economic statecraft tools within the European Union, with no clear answer or answers varying depending on who you ask. The first question is, in any given EU member state, which institution is implementing, say, let's take the example of sanctions, if we take a look at economic statecraft, who's in charge? And actually the answer will really vary depending on who you ask and the member state that you are considering. In some member states, I'm thinking of France, it's really a sovereign question, so you would have the French Treasury, the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but in others, such as Germany, it's more of a technical question, so you would have the Bundesbank, for instance, or a specialized agency. The second question that one could ask is, to who could the private sector send queries? Well, it's not really clear in Brussels. Who should you send queries to? And finally, is there an org chart available about who is doing what, at what stage? How does that all work? And to our knowledge, there is no org chart available. I would love to see one personally, because I think it is very difficult to understand how everything works for economic statecraft tools. And so the truth is there is no single correct answer to any of these questions. And I think that this illustrates three things about the EU approach to economic statecraft. The first thing is that EU economic statecraft tools, so again, let's take a look at sanctions, but we could take a look at other measures such as export controls, investment screening mechanisms. Well, they are adopted at the EU level. We talk about EU sanctions, but they are implemented at the member state level. So you have 27 different member states implementing these tools in a very different way. The second thing that is really obvious is that the EU's economic security apparatus has been born through crisis, firefighting operations. For instance, in 2014, after the annexation of Crimea, or in 2022, after a full-blown invasion of Ukraine. So it's not really the product of a deep reflection about how things should work, but more the product of, well, emergency crisis modes. And the third thing, as Abe was mentioning, is really this lack of coordination, vertical coordination between the EU and member states, and horizontal coordination between member states, you know, say Spain talking to Estonia or other EU member states. And I think that everything that we are seeing comes with really important consequences. If you take a look at the life cycle of any given sanction, at the development stage, when you create a sanction, you have no mechanism for, say, enforcement people, say, customs officials, you know, the people really on the ground doing the nitty-gritty of implementing stuff, giving feedback about what works, what doesn't work from their experience to policymakers in Brussels. So a lack, you know, of vertical coordination here at the development stage of a sanction. Then you implement a sanction, we see again this fragmentation, because for instance, for licenses, it's essentially sanctions waivers. If you want to do something that is normally outlawed, well, every single member state has a different view about how to grant a waiver. So again, you see this fragmentation. And then third, at the enforcement level, well, we were calculating with Abe that if you're based in Sweden, the potential fine for sanctions violations is 50 times less than if you're based in the Netherlands. So this is quite different. And again, a lot of fragmentation. So I think that the whole idea, what we're trying to look at with this EU economic security network, is to get the people to talk more to each other vertically, horizontally, to actually deepen this economic security culture at the European level and reduce this fragmentation.
Very clear. And now we got another metaphor. We went from sailing to doctors. So Abe, if you were now the doctor, which I presume you are, how would you then cure the patient? In other words, what's the elevator pitch for your proposal ESN?
Yes, I mean, so now I'm going to be an architect. No, I'm not going to throw it out.
Football player. No.
Exactly,
Sorry.
exactly. I like to do Zumba, so I'll be a dance instructor. No, I'm not. Basically, I think, as I said before, I don't think this is rocket science. This isn't something that needs to be reinvented. The European Union really has this model in multiple other sectors. And so what we are suggesting is, this isn't going to solve all problems, but we think it will be a major advance in Europe's capability to govern itself in economic security domains. And that structure is very simple. It basically asks member states to identify the appropriate person that does the implementation of the respected economic security domain. So whether that's sanctions, export controls, investment screening, that those groups would then meet regularly. In the case of data privacy, they meet in Brussels. In medicines, it's like a separate location in a different city. Many of the regulatory agencies, they meet in different locations across the member states. And then there's often a contact from the commission that comes to those meetings to learn about what's happening in the member states. And so it's an ongoing, regular exercise of interaction amongst the implementers of the respected economic security domain. And then the details, we don't want to be too prescriptive of, like, for example, in several of these regulatory networks, they have like a joint database of regulatory actions that affect multiple members, and they update that database to see, is there a sanctions episode that has trans-border consequences. Just that simple, action allows the different regulators to know, oh, you know what? The Germans are facing the same problem. Maybe we should coordinate with them on this question. In other cases, they do regulatory sweeps of a hot topic issue where they say, okay, we are all facing the shadow fleet, let's say in the Russia sanctions issue. So how are we going to manage that hot topic issue? Once again, I don't think that Agathe and I we're not at the phase of saying this is what needs to happen in this network, but it's a basic structure that has proved successful across multiple other domains, and we think it would improve the implementation and also the development of policy across a whole host of economic security questions.
And not to lose ourselves in the nitty-gritty of this, but I guess somebody has to do the coordination. I mean, who is in charge of these various network groups?
Yes, I mean, usually they establish a secretariat, and that secretariat is funded by the commission, but it's really very, I mean, at least in many of these, it's a very minimal amount of money or organization. Usually one of the network members is appointed as the head of it in a rotating basis, and then they switch who's in charge, and that person then sends out the emails for the meetings and hosting the meetings. So it's not a large institutional or bureaucratic footprint. It's really more about coordinating these different actors to come together.
Agathe, do you want to add something before we go to the commission?
I think it is, from my perspective, the one thing that I would add, perhaps adding to what just I've said, is this wouldn't cost a lot of money. We're talking about a small secretariat, organizing the meetings. And I think that the beauty here of the potential scheme is that it would instantly clarify who is in charge of what in EU member states. You would have, an opportunity to build a pan-European culture around economic statecraft. Wouldn't cost a lot of money. The idea is really to have something that we streamline. And again, yes, we're not at all prescriptive. It's really an idea. It will probably evolve, but we are confident that it could really help.
And now we go to the, did you want to add something, Abe?
Yeah, I did want to just add one thing, which is that what we've seen in many other of these network-based solutions is that when you ask member states to identify representatives in their home market that are responsible for these European-wide questions, it often leads to better resourcing of those actors because they realize their reputation is at stake. They're going to be in this community of regulators. And as Agathe has said, it creates a culture around a European-wide version of whatever that regulatory domain is. And so I think one of the things that we have often been struck is even at the member state level, the lack of resources or the lack of kind of regularized contact and coordination around economic security expertise. And so we think a major goal or positive outcome of the economic security network would be that member states will be like, oh, we need to take this seriously, and we're going to step up our own contribution in this space.
Okay, so now we know what the ESN is. We also know that it's not rocket science, always a dangerous term to use. And now we have to ask a practitioner. I mean, how do you look upon this? And I started out quoting Kierkegaard, and I'll now quote him in Danish. Alle ønsker forandring, alle ønsker udvikling, ingen ønsker forandring. And the reason why I'm quoting Søren Kierkegaard in Danish is that our next speaker, Redonnet, actually has put Danish down in his CV as one of his language skills. On a far more serious note, you are, as already said, Deputy Director General for Trade and Economic Security in the EU Commission. You have a very long experience in trade matters, having worked for Commissioner Peter Mandelson and also Commissioner Pascal Lamy. You also know a lot about the WTO. We may get back to that at a later stage during this conversation. Thank you so much for being here, and now over to you.
Thanks, Lykke. I think I will stick to my day job as a bureaucrat and not try to become a translator from Danish, because I'm going to fall short, notwithstanding what I put in my CV. Second, look, I appreciate very much the opportunity to engage in a public setting on these ideas that are being brought forward. It's a pleasure to be subject to the clinical examination of Dr. Newman and Dr. Demarais. But we welcome this, because evidently this whole construction of set of policies around the notions of economic security and statecraft are relatively new in public policy. They cut across different policy areas, and so we are constructing this certainly in Europe, but I think in other jurisdictions progressively. I think what I'll do is maybe I'll come to the prescriptions of the doctors and the recommendation on, for example, this idea of a network perhaps at the end, but let me just maybe take a step back and think a bit about how we see some of the structural challenges in this area. But maybe starting with perhaps a positive note, which is that even if we are facing challenges of novelty, challenges of organization, challenges of resourcing in these areas, we do as European Union geoeconomics, and we do have some means to do geoeconomics. I was thinking before the conversation that actually we have been accused in the past for a long time of using external economic policy tools, for example, the common commercial policy, as a proxy for foreign policy making at the time when, of course, EU's foreign policy was more incipient. Now, of course, we are in a different situation. We're talking here about the hard economic power in a harder geopolitical world, and I understand this is the theme here, the underlying issue. The other thing is, I think there is a very clear awareness across the EU institutions, member states, governments, that there is something going on, that hard geopolitics is reconfiguring, rewriting the rules of international economic relations, and that we have to navigate this and adapt to that. I don't think that anybody contests at a doctrinal level that this is the world in which we are in. So there is a form of realism and awareness, which is the basis for action. And that means, I think, by the way, action in two different zones, which are distinct. One is more defensive, and I think the paper refers to this, is developing economic security in the sense of economic resilience policies for the internal market, which implies some degree of de-risking of certain linkages that we have, notably through trade and investment, and a more offensive economic statecraft set of policies, where there we're really leveraging economic tools in order to push foreign policy goals as such. And I think these are two slightly different things. Now, we are able to do hard geoeconomics at record speed sometimes. But I agree that with the paper that we tend to do this when we're in crisis. Now, I think this is typically what has happened in the case of the Russia sanctions at EU level. I can focus a bit more on my beat, if you want, which is the trade sanctions as opposed to the financial sanctions. But in the case of Russia, which after all pre-war was our 5th largest trading partner, it was a huge trade and investment footprint between the EU and Russia. We have massively decoupled and reduced dependencies, in particular on the import side. And as you mentioned today, the Commission is taking yet another step, which is a very significant step with respect to weaning ourselves off on any energy dependency on Russia. We have also, frankly, weaponized some of the Russia's dependencies vis-à-vis the EU and vis-à-vis the G7 in the context of the trade sanctions, for example, through the use of export control measures relating to advanced technology items, economically critically goods that the Russian economy needs, in particular to transform itself into a war economy. And we have, after all, adopted 16 successive packages of sanctions containing, at every stage, a further tightening of the noose in this direction. By the way, we've done this at unanimity, which shows that the decision-making, institutional issues are not necessarily always an obstacle to this kind of policy making. In a way, I think for us, the Russia sanctions have been a very interesting, hard, but interesting laboratory of a hard geopolitical decoupling, because this is effectively what we did over a very, very short period of times. On a more structural or systemic basis, I would also argue, and happy to be contested on that point, that we have equipped ourselves over time and over the last few years in particular with a number of tools at European level which we didn't have before. I mean, so first of all, we have an economic strategy that rests not just on protect type economic statecraft tools, strategic trade controls, strategic investment controls, etc. A lot of what you have been talking about earlier on the panel, sanctions, also on the promote side of the economic security strategy. After all, I mean, we are sometimes accused by third countries of excessively leveraging the Brussels effect of the strength of the single market. So that is a form of geoeconomics. So if we are criticized for doing it, it means that we must be doing it to some extent. And then we've developed a number of tools, I think, which are more in the sort of offensive statecraft side, defensive or offensive, whether they relate to reciprocity, whether they relate to an expansion of the notion of trade defense with, again, novel instruments, unilateral tools, for example, to deal with the distortive effect of foreign subsidies on the internal market, an anti-coercion instrument, which is an interesting hybrid because it is a legal statute at EU level, which operates at the border between foreign policy and international economic policy, with novel decision-making processes associated with it. So, an enhanced European framework, still in the making, but basically an existing European framework when it comes to strategic trade controls and strategic investment controls. Where we have now been operating a coordination mechanism to screen inward foreign direct investment for security and public order since 2020, and have looked at more than 2,000 transactions as a union of member states. So in a way, I think you could say we have a lot of tools. Of course, you can have legal statutes, you can have tools. It all depends on the political determination to use them, the capacity to execute and implement on some of these legal authorities, but they are there. Now, having said all this, I would also very much agree that there is a delta, and maybe a few thoughts about, thinking about how we go forward in these areas. I think there is given what I've said before, we can certainly, I think, give more coherence and project more coherence in the use of these different instruments and tools in the geoeconomic toolbox, especially because many of these tools are unilateral instruments. And I think we are increasingly looking inside the Commission at giving more predictability, more readability about how these tools are supposed to be used depending on the different types of economic security resilience issues we face. And this is why the new Trade and Economic Security Commissioner inside the European Commission, Maroš Šefčovič, has been mandated to develop a doctrine of use of these instruments. How much is there non-uniform application at EU level of measures that are really EU measures? I'm not so sure that this is a core problem. I mean, evidently, there's a lot of decentralized implementation, and certainly I would agree decentralized enforcement in some areas. That is certainly the case of sanctions. I'm not sure that this is necessarily uniform. That non-uniform application is necessarily the bigger challenge. Probably enforcement, unified enforcement, is probably a bigger challenge. Now, the real, in my view, the greatest institutional challenge for the EU, which is always going to be greater for the EU, is indeed that not being a unitary state, so being a federation of nation states. For the EU, there is much more complexity in the governance of economic statecraft policies than for unitary states. I mean, I would say it's almost self-evident. And that is because we have economic security policies that are both designed and implemented, not just implemented, but sometimes designed, at least in part, at these two levels of government, at the central level and a sub-central level. Essentially, a lot designed at EU level when they concern the resilience, the security of the single market, because there, of course, there is a common good, which is the single market, that requires having some centralization of the tool associated with it. But of course, also tools, policies that are going to be much more logically placed at national level when they address issues which are closer to national security or essential security. So there are different objectives being pursued at different levels of government in the EU. Now, that requires two things, actually. It's not just a governance issue. I think it does require for us to be continuously evolving in terms of institutional design and solutions. So I think for me, the two examples of this are how do we Europeanize more our approach to strategic trade and investment controls without changing the fundamental nature of these instruments being anchored in national security? And how do we learn from experiments such as an instrument, the anti-coercion instrument, which again deals with issues at the border of two different areas and on the basis of new decision-making processes and forms of delegations of competence to the European Commission. To summarize it, the anti-coercion instrument has a determination phase, which belongs to member states on a qualified majority basis, not on a unanimity basis. But then a remedy phase where there is a delegation of competence to the European Commission, anchored and inspired by the traditional comitology type procedures that we have in the common commercial policy. Now that is very novel, but it also shows that we can be institutionally nimble. But in the institutional or legal aspect is one thing. I think the governance structure issue is also very important. So I agree that I will finish with this, that governance and capabilities, not just governance, but capabilities, governance being very much at the core of the paper by Agathe and Abe, is something that we absolutely recognize is essential. Why? Because in most of these economic security, economic statecraft considerations and policies are inherently whole of government. So they are never in a policy silo. That's what we have, a whole of government approach to this with the so-called 3 Ps: protect, promote, partner. That in itself shows you that you got to play on a panoply, let's say, of areas and instruments. And also because at the foundation of an economic security strategy is it has to be risk-based. It's about de-risking, therefore it's about an analysis of risk. And so it's very important, I think, to progressively foster for the EU as a whole a common understanding, of the risks. This is very much at the heart of the economic security strategy set out in 2023. And in order to arrive at that, you need to develop a common culture of understanding what risk is from a geopolitical and geoeconomic nature. In a way, you kind of almost have to create an epistemological community of a new kind within within government circles, within in this case within bureaucracies. Now that implies several things. We of course have to do our homework as the EU Commission, so as an institution. That's why, again, there have been changes in the second von der Leyen Commission to that effect, a new Trade and Economic Security Commissioner and Directorate General, which is where I work, and a reorganization of the internal structures in the Commission. I mean, basically, the Commission, if you consider the Commission is a college of commissioners, works like a cabinet government, there is a dedicated sort of equivalent of a cabinet committee, which operates on a regular basis, chaired by the Economic Security Commissioner, supported by a network of the equivalent of the permanent secretaries or the vice ministers of all the different DGs that are involved with this, which churns this work internally. But I would very much agree that, of course, the bigger challenge is the articulation of work between the Commission and the member states. And this is where I think the idea of the network comes in. I think that there are two very important things that we're trying to get right. One is the degree of granularity in the interactions on policymaking between 27 member states and the European Commission. And of course, it's difficult because of size, but this is an area and a set of policies that require a lot of granularity in the type of information, expertise exchange, etc. Also requires confidentiality as well, given the nature of the beast. And so I think the idea, which underpins, I think, what you say in the paper, establishing a network of officials which are central hubs in a whole of government manner between Commission and member states, we think is a good one, because we think that you need to reinforce both the vertical coordination, Commission member states, but also the horizontal coordination inside member states apparatus. And all of them are undertaking changes. And I think supporting this change in policy and structure that is ongoing is certainly things where we are going to look at options and ideas, and the ones that are presented by you, by the ECFR paper, are welcome ideas in this respect. But I leave it there.
Thank you very much. Very sort of precise, but also really sort of thought-provoking, intervention. We don't have that much time left, but you mentioned culture, and there is actually a question on culture here by Alberto Rizzi. Maybe you'll sort of reflect on that. How important would an EU economic security network be in terms of establishing and diffusing a common European culture about economic statecraft within different member states, agencies, to strengthen the effectiveness of investment screening and also export controls? So that could be a question to you. And Agathe or Abe, if I was now Xi Jinping, just for 2 minutes or maybe just 1 minute, I don't think it will keep me up at night to read this paper and sort of read that, well, now the EU set up a network in this particular area. You already said, Agathe, this is the first step. So what could be the next step? A couple of times you have both mentioned the medical area, but as far as I remember, we have an agency to that area. So the EMA, is that what you are thinking about when you refer to that? So what could be the next step? But let's start with the culture question, Denis.
So no, I very much agree with this. I think there is a commonality of culture inside the EU, but in silos. So you have sort of filière or work streams of particular expertise, kind of regulator to regulator type commonalities. But here the challenge is to also horizontalize this, because it is whole of government, and because behind the economic security questions and policies there are trade-offs, because there are costs to economic security. So because there are costs, there are trade-offs. Because there are trade-offs, there are distributional effects among member states. So you cannot do this in a silo. So I think we need to have to build common capabilities and expertise in specific areas, because you're looking for example, at a number of advanced emerging digital tech sectors, and the question of technological indispensability in this area requiring a lot of technical expertise. But at the same time, you connect this to the geopolitical environment. So there you need to also be able to horizontalize. So I think it's a combination of these two things, which you have to do at the same time if you want to develop your, let's say, your economic statecraft capabilities.
Could I just?
Thank you. Next step.
I do want
Yes, sir.
to. I just want to underscore the stakes. You know, it seems like, let's say, a small effort to create this kind of network, but in Agathe and our research, when we went around to major member states and talked about how are they implementing something as important as the price cap on Russian gas and oil, it was, I would say, a very ad hoc effort to implement this very major policy position of the European Union. And if you are President Xi in China, and exactly right here on our boxes, and the European Union threatens to impose sanctions for some Chinese action, but you know that the member states have no way of implementing those or enforcing those sanctions, then what is the credible threat? And I think that this is a problem that Europe faces again and again, which is the Commission comes up with a very interesting, great policy, but when you filter down to the member states, there is no regularized basis to implement, at least in one major member state where I was doing interviews, it was just individuals who were interested in this topic. There was no ministerial level mandate to have a regular interaction amongst even within that country. And so that is, you know, if you compare that to the United States, where we have an organization like OFAC with hundreds of people that are daily working on identifying targets, figuring out enforcement holes, you know, working on the implementation task. You know, if you're sitting in China, this is paper tigers over in Brussels. And so I think we cannot underestimate the importance, even though it seems simple, of this kind of effort. But I will turn it over to Agathe about the next steps.
I wanted to actually say a few things also following everything that Denis has said. So I think the credibility question is really key. If you are Xi Jinping, actually you have zero hope of an improvement in ties between China and the US. But Europe is the big prize, you know, very wealthy market. And actually at ECFR, well, I published a few months ago a policy brief highlighting that Europe's stance would be critical in a conflict around Taiwan, because it is the big question mark. If there are European sanctions against China in such a scenario, then of course things are quite different for the Chinese leadership. So I think that the EU is key, it's the big prize. And really the question is how to project credibility and how can the EU best leverage its market, but also its financial assets, its technological choke points. And then on the question of culture, and I'll do that in about 30 seconds, because I know, Lykke, you want to finish on time. I think that what struck me listening to Denis is we are building, and Russia sanctions were a laboratory. So we're still really in the phase where we are building things and we can shape how things will look like in terms of European frameworks for economic security. So I think that this is very promising. And two other things that I wanted to mention that are maybe linked to the culture question. So of course, it's all about promoting a pan-European culture around economic security. It's also about boosting informal ties. You know, say you're a French civil servant, you have a cross-border case with Poland. Who do you call? Well, actually, if you're part of the EU Economic Security Network, you know who to call. So that is just such informal ties that can really make a difference. And then finally, there's the question of international collaboration. We're touching upon that with Abe in the report. We also think that it would be hugely beneficial in some instances to have representatives from the UK, the US, Canada, Australia, other like-minded allies, Japan, of course, that do a lot of work. Norway, of course, that do a lot of work in economic security, and that will be critical for Europeans, especially under Trump 2.0. I'll stop here, it's 45.
Excellent. Thank you very much to the three of you. I started out this session with quoting Kierkegaard, so I'll obviously also end with him. Life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forward. Our speakers, I think you have very clearly sort of showed us that we need to have a new sort of version of this. Yes, we live forward, but we also have to understand why it's so important for us to act now. So thank you so much for joining us. Do read the paper, which is obviously on the ECFR homepage, and enjoy the rest of your day. We may even have a German chancellor at a certain stage. Who knows?